Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, we got an interesting and fun challenge and a little bit of a cautionary tale. It's an integral forged kitchen utility knife. So if you're into high-end kitchen knives, you'll notice that some reasonably expensive kitchen knives are forged from one piece of steel so that there is a bolster, which is that basically heavy piece of metal or steel, whatever it might be, that comes between the handle and the blade itself. That's actually forged integrally into the entire knife itself. In other words, it's all forged from one piece. Now, if you're Henkel's or Wusthof or one of those expensive high-end kitchen knife manufacturers, you've got a big giant press and you stick a bar of steel in there and you push a button and ka-chunk, it forges in a very short period of time one of these blades in its rough form anyway. So the question is, can you do this yourself? The answer is yes, but it's quite a challenge. So we're going to take on that challenge today. So what we'll be forging today is what's known as a utility knife in the kitchen. It's just a medium-sized jack-of-all-trades blade. A little bigger than a paring knife, a little smaller than a boning knife, sort of a thin, elongated blade. This one will work out to have about a 5-inch blade. I gotta say, I'm excited about this project. Why? Well, I'll tell you, it's a challenging and fairly high-skill process. What's life without challenges? Let's give it a whirl and see what we can do. Normally, I like to just launch into the project, but it's worth talking about what you're up against when forging an integral. If you don't understand the challenges up front, you'll have a hard time cracking this nut. So, among the many tricky aspects of forging integral knives is that stock that's appropriately sized for your handle isn't necessarily appropriately sized for the blade you're intending to forge. Now, of course, you can just pound out a blade and whatever size it comes out to, you just say, hey, that works for me. But in this case, that's not really an option. Why? Because we have a very particular blade size and shape in mind from the get-go. Now the stock I'm forging here is 5/8 inch W2 steel. That's about 14 millimeters. If we just whaled away and made whatever blade came naturally, we'd end up with a blade roughly 1.5 inches wide, maybe even a little more depending on how hard I forged it. In other words, it would be sort of a skinny chef's knife with this super skinny, goofy looking little handle on it. But we're setting out to make a slim bladed utility knife. So that's going to create a few extra obstacles, making steel do stuff that it doesn't really want to do. There's a technical bladesmithing term for this. It's called fun. In this particular knife, the handle is going to be cylindrical. In other words, we're going to preserve the exact diameter and shape of the stock that we're using to forge the knife. And that's going to create a few little challenges in and of itself. So basically, if we ding up the section of stock that is used for making the handle, if we change its shape, if we indent it or elongate it or do anything screwy to it, it's going to end up being useless to us for this particular design of knife. So we're going to have to be really careful about that handle. Alright, with that said, my first job is to put a point on the knife. We do this by lifting the stock up and hammering on an angle. When you're putting a point on stock, you always want to forge forcefully and while the steel is nice and hot. Forging into the corners of the stock so that you're forcing those corners back into the body of the bar. Whether it's cylindrical or square, it's still got that corner on it where you cut it off. So if you just whack down on it willy-nilly, you're going to end up with something that's known as fish mouth, where the corners fold over and cause an inclusion at the point of the blade. Forging integrals is all about the transition between the blade and the handle. As we said, you want the handle to maintain the shape of the stock, yet you want the edge to flow cleanly down from the blade. Now, if you just whack away on a piece of round stock and try to form a blade shape, it'll form into a sort of spear, with the blade expanding equally on both the blade and the spine edges. And this is no good. We're not trying to make a spear. Now, the conventional way of fixing this sort of problem would be to put the stock on the edge of the anvil with the blade part hanging off the edge, and then whack the top of the junction so as to drive the spine down into line with the handle. But this will flatten out your stock on the handle, and you won't be able to preserve the round shape of the stock that you're planning on maintaining so as to use for a handle. So, what do? Well, the tricky answer is you have to be really careful. But beyond that, there's a little planning. So let's watch how this works. Normally, I'm a little impatient with YouTube videos that just show a whole process of something from beginning to end with no editing. So you have to sit there and watch somebody do some really boring thing ad infinitum. But I'm going to show you as much of this forging as you can stomach, because I think there's some value in kind of seeing the entire sequence. And hopefully you'll be able to see how this whole process works. So once I've formed the point, the first thing I'm going to do is draw out the steel. It'll look sort of like I'm forging a blade, but I'm not really. I'm actually forging a sort of preform from which the final blade will be forged. As I said, in order for the bar we're using to be appropriately sized for the handle we have in mind, the blade portion needs to be drawn out and thinned substantially, while the handle shape remains unchanged. So that's what we're doing here. And fortunately for us, that's also going to solve some other little problems that you can potentially have when forging integrals. Now notice, I'm not letting the handle portion touch the anvil at all. So I keep drawing it out, keeping the preform about the same width as the handle. Again, if I didn't thin it out as I was drawing it out, I'd end up with a super wide knife, which I don't want. I'm aiming for a blade that'll only be about 3/4 of an inch wide at its widest point. That's about 2 centimeters. So you'll notice right here a series of what could be mistaken for hammer dings in the blade, but they're not hammer dings. This is intentional. I'm actually canting the hammer handle slightly down as I hammer, so that the rear edge of the hammer face is the only surface that's impacting the blade. That has the result of drawing the steel out. I'm also hitting right there on the corner of the anvil. Taken together, this is going to stretch that steel out towards the point. I'm not trying to overpower the blade, I'm just letting the hammer do the work, taking my time. So I'm just trying to kind of enjoy the experience and feel my way through the process. As I reach the point where my preform is looking about right, I'll start driving some metal downward, starting to distinguish the edge from the spine. Again, I'm just doing it with subtle control of the hammer blows, trying to forge relatively evenly on both sides of the blade. We want the blade to remain symmetrical from side to side. If we work one side more than the other, we'll end up with an off-center blade. This can be fixed, but better to do it right from the beginning. I'm working to refine both the shape of the blade and to thin it down, creating the bevels. See, it's starting to look more like a knife and less like a spear. Notice that I hammer in one place and move the blade, rather than moving the hammer back and forth across the blade. This helps me maintain more consistent hammer blows and hammer angles, and it reduces fatigue. The hammer's now coming down at a slight angle, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, which has the effect of driving the bevel downward and outward, forming the edge. Now, there's a tiny dip on the spine between the blade and the handle. Conventionally, I could remedy this by hanging the blade off the edge, leaving the stock on the anvil. blade side down, and lightly whacking everything true so there's a nice clean line along the spine. But I can't do that here without messing up the handle, because I want that handle to remain perfectly cylindrical. So what I do is very, very carefully perch the transitional area of the blade on the anvil and just whack flat down on it. This will drive a little bit of steel in all directions. All we care about is that it's driving it out towards the spine, of course, and it'll give us just enough material to raise that spine maybe a couple hundredths of an inch. That's all we need. Finally, I'll give it one more heat to just gently straighten and correct everything. I always take this last heat to just give it one last hard look and make sure everything's right. Proportions, symmetry, overall shape, straightness, whatever. If it's not right, fix it now. Now, by the time you get to this point, sometimes you're a little bored, you're tired, whatever, and there's a temptation to just bail out and say, well, I'll fix it when I grind it. I always try to resist that temptation. This is my chance to kind of step back and give it one last critical evaluation. At this point, you're sort of like a chef giving it that last little sprinkle of salt and pepper to make it taste exactly the way you want it. The difference between a good-looking knife and a mediocre one is often very subtle. So the more I can perfect the shape now, the less I have to torture it into what I want on the grinder. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you can find more of my work. You'll also find plenty more videos there that you can't find on YouTube, with very, very detailed information about all aspects of Japanese blade making. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades.